friends. And so I have seen her in at least 10 years and had to find out about her children who are now grown. You know, you meet an old friend and in your mind, their children are still little kids, but now they're, you know, professionals studying in the United States. So we had to catch up. But thank you all for joining again for day 2 of our session on managing emotions mindfully. And so yesterday, what we talked about, you know, was emotions in general. We talked about the definition of emotions. We talked about the fact that the idea of emotions, kind of the English word emotions and the idea of emotions in psychology, there isn't an exact equivalent in the Buddhist philosophical texts. And so you know, there's some overlap, but some differences between the idea of a klesha or a mental affliction and an emotion. And they're different perspectives. We said that in the Buddhist philosophical system, when we talk about the mental afflictions, it's mostly things that are disturbing to our peace of mind and interfere with our meditation practice. That's the focus in the Buddhist philosophical systems. Whereas in modern psychology, when we talk about destructive emotions, we talk about emotions that are harmful to our own and others' well-being. So obviously there's a lot of overlap between those two categories, especially in terms of the anger family of emotions. There are a lot that are the same, but there are a lot of things on the list of kleshas or mental afflictions that are disturbing to the peace of mind or are disturbing to our meditation, not necessarily destructive in that way. So it's important to be clear about the terminology, because I found in my studies of Buddhist psychology, sometimes, you know, klesha is defined as disturbing emotions, but that's not exactly accurate. So we talked about that. We talked about the definition of an emotion. We said it's a process that is dependent on this automatic appraisal, you know, that really prompts us into a quick response to a situation, because the function of emotions, one of the functions is to save our lives, to coordinate diverse response systems so that we can act quickly. If we needed to figure everything out, if when the stimulus was coming in, we needed to go through a whole conceptual process to figure out how to respond, often we wouldn't respond in time, right? You know, you see, I mean, in North America, I remember when I moved to Canada, they had a lot of bears. And when you moved to this place in Canada, you had to take this class called Bear Aware. And they would teach you how to react with the 2 kinds of bears that were there. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I have to take a class about how to like survive an attack by a bear. Obviously, when you see a bear in the woods, you don't, you know, oh, large brown animal with little round ear, you know, you don't go through the whole thing. You just immediately recognize and respond. And so emotions were designed to save time, save our lives, coordinate these diverse response systems. But, you know, often they're triggered not just by things that are innate or evolutionary, but by our learned and our personal past as well. And this is where we can sometimes attenuate these triggers of emotion, because sometimes the trigger is inappropriate. We're responding with an inappropriate emotion to the situation or an inappropriate level, sometimes the inappropriate emotion altogether. So that's why we talk about constructive and destructive emotions. We say all emotions can be useful and constructive. It depends on how we enact the emotion. And so as we discussed a lot yesterday, we get away in this kind of paradigm from the idea of positive and negative emotions in terms of just how they feel to us subjectively. Like a positive emotion, you know, life is supposed to be a Pepsi commercial all the time with everybody dancing around and laughing. I mean, that's completely inappropriate. All emotions are useful at the right time, in the right kind of level. For example, we talked about the emotion of sadness, which doesn't feel good, but It elicits care and nurturing in the face of a shared loss when we're expressing an emotion like sadness. And then it tells us that what we've lost is something important to us. So we talked about the themes of all of the 7 universal emotions and why all of them can be either constructive or destructive. It really depends on the situation. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus on anger, because anger is something that I think most people recognize out of the main emotions can often be the most destructive to both our own and others' well-being. But according to the modern psychological view, anger can be enacted constructively. So what does constructive anger look like? How does this accord with some of the Buddhist teachings about anger? That's what we're going to be focusing on today. But before we get into anger per se, I wanted to share one slide we ran out of time for yesterday, with just kind of an overview of how to manage our emotions mindfully, just in general. Then we'll talk about anger. After talking about anger for a while, I have a meditation practice, an analytical or conceptual meditation practice on anger that we'll also do at the end of the session that'll give us some kind of contemplative practice that we can utilize for dealing with anger. So I'm going to share a slide with just a couple of pointers about how we can manage our emotions mindfully, just in general. So to moderate our emotional behaviors, keeping a log of regrettable emotional episodes, including the trigger for that emotion and the behavior that was regrettable. And so when you have a couple of entries, 10 or 15, what do the triggers have in common? Is there an underlying story, pattern, or narrative, or script? And what I mean by this, we looked yesterday, we did the meditation practice of rain, and one of the steps of that meditation practice was investigating. Is there some kind of underlying story? For example, if we are triggered for a strong emotion that seems inappropriate because nobody else around us is experiencing the same emotion, maybe we feel like we're overreacting in some way, or we're very triggered. If we kind of keep track of these kind of emotional episodes, then we can analyze, why am I triggered? What's going on here? Is there some kind of an underlying story or pattern or narrative? I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were talking about how we both had an experience that when somebody lets us down, like when we're counting on someone to do something for us, maybe we've even asked for help with something, and then somebody has to change the date, or something else comes up, or they can't show up, that for both of us, it's very triggering because of our personal pasts of feeling like maybe we couldn't really count on the people that were meant to support us in our lives. That was just a personal example. And so instead of just going, oh, my friend was supposed to help me Tuesday and he had to postpone to Friday, no big deal, right? We had an emotional response, and that came from an underlying story of, oh, I can't really trust people. Like, people are just going to constantly let me down. So that kind of thing, right? When we feel like our reaction is maybe out of proportion to the actual thing that happened, why is it especially triggering for us? In the full Cultivating Emotional Balance class, we investigate something called the Emotional Alert Database. And this is both the universal and a lot of the personal kind of experience that we've had, especially early in life, that makes certain situations triggering for us, especially. And so bringing some insight into this can really help. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be triggered for the emotion when the thing happens again, but the more insight we have into why, we can immediately remember, oh, that's my story. People are going to let me down. That's an old story that I have, right? It's not necessarily going to happen in this case. That's not happening with my friend right now. I don't need to really believe that story, believe that narrative. So that can be really helpful. And then we might be able to recognize in advance situations that are likely to lead to strong emotions and either avoid them or prepare for them, rehearsing alternative behavior. And for those of us that are meditators, I often think so much of our meditation practice is rehearsing alternative behavior for these situations. And this is the way we're going to look at this today. We're going to do an example of an anger meditation. But taking our real life onto the meditation cushion and rehearsing mentally, right? Like you've had a situation, you've responded with anger, or you've responded with some kind of strong emotion, replaying it in your mind and imagining yourself responding differently can be in a very effective way to use our meditation practice. It shouldn't just be some theoretical thing, but using the actual situations in our life. Now, avoiding situations likely to lead to strong emotions, this isn't denial as much as it is until we get stronger, until we develop techniques to deal with situations. In the meantime, avoiding them can be the best strategy, and it's okay. And it's not just saying, oh, I'm never going to deal with that. It's just saying, right now, this is really triggering of a strong emotion for me, so I should try and avoid this situation until I've figured out and rehearsed an alternative behavior for that. Reminding ourselves to reappraise the trigger, disabling the trigger by removing those cognitive projections that distort our view. And going back to my own example of, oh, my friend is going to let me down, right? That's a cognitive distortion. I'm, kind of projecting onto my friend some of the earlier kind of traumas about feeling let down by people that were caring for me earlier in my life. And so that's a distortion to just assume, oh yeah, this person also is going to let me down, right? So reappraising the trigger can help disable that as a strong trigger of emotion. Broadening the understanding of the other person's situation. So much of the time when we're feeling strongly emotional, it's all about us, right? Our perspective really narrows and we're just thinking about the impact of the situation on ourselves. But in this case, when we can have some empathy and some perspective taking and broaden our view, try and see what's going on from the other person's point of view. Often, I found, especially for things like anger, disappointment, sadness, we're acting as if the other person's behavior towards us was designed to hurt us somehow, or make us sad or make us angry. Mostly other people are just trying to find happiness and avoid suffering, just like we are. Maybe they're not even thinking about us at all. So if we try and broaden our perspective and understand the other person's behavior, understand what needs are being fulfilled for them, put ourselves in their shoes, often this can really help with the trigger. And then finally, even if we can't reappraise, we can choose to interrupt our actions, control our face and voice, and at least resist the impulses to act, right? We might still be very triggered. We might still be feeling a really strong emotion, but at least don't act in a way that is harmful to oneself and others, right? And then kind of work backwards. It's easier to stop the actions of the face, voice, actions, and then kind of working backwards and attenuating the triggers so that we don't become inappropriately emotional in a way that's destructive. And that's kind of the way that we can work. So these are just some kind of general, for all kinds of emotional reactions that we feel that are destructive emotional episodes, in order to bring awareness, which can really help us attenuate those reactions. So I'm going to stop the share for just a minute and see if there's any questions or comments. So that's a quick list. We'll share the PowerPoints from you. You'll have the recording of this session, but any questions about any of those to clarify? Okay, so we'll be sharing those. Oh, yeah. Did anybody have a question? I heard
Yeah,
somebody.
Priya here.
Yeah, hi,
I
Priya.
have, hello. I have a question, and my question is, what if the triggers are so strong that we're overwhelmed and we can't really think logically at that point in time to see the story from the other person's perspective?
You know, I think the most useful thing we can do if we feel so strongly triggered is to try to get out of the situation as soon as possible before we react. And then maybe when we've calmed down, we say that there's a space after we've become emotional that sometimes we call the refractory period in psychology. And we say anything that happens within that period of time is just going to reinforce the emotion that we're experiencing. So when you're emotional, that's why it doesn't work to apologize to someone right away when they're really angry at you, because anything you do just reinforces the emotion that they're feeling. So try and get out of the situation, calm down, let some time pass. And then sometimes we can take the situation to the meditation cushion or just contemplate it after we're calm and maybe have a different perspective on the situation. Then we might be able to see it from the other person's perspective. But while we're in the middle of still feeling emotional, it's almost impossible. Everything we think about will just reinforce that emotion, and that's something that we evolve to do. And an example of that refractory period is, let's say that you're walking down the street and somebody jumps, you're walking down the street in the dark towards the subway and somebody jumps out and steals your purse, right? What's going to happen for the next 10 minutes as you're walking down the dark street? You're going to be hyper vigilant. Every motion is going to make you react in fear because this thing just happened and you're still in the middle of that. It protects you from further threat. So it's a useful thing, but it's not helpful when you're trying to get out of that emotional episode. You have to just wait until that emotion has passed, because you can't think logically in that point. Your frontal cortex is not online. You're not able to really think things through. Your amygdala, the threat system, is firing. So it's kind of impossible. So getting yourself out of the situation, calming down, and then you might be able to reappraise, and then rehearsing an alternative behavior if it's something that happens, a trigger that you've identified from kind of keeping track of the emotional episodes, then you might be able to rehearse alternative behavior. Does that help, Priya?
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Tijal and then Anjali.
Yeah, Venerable, I wanted to ask you that what I know from, let's say, some Western psychology and also nonviolent communication, that the process of reappraisal, of, rewiring, reappraisal happens through a lot of relational practices. Like, for example, your therapist might help you to reparent, to help you to reappraise,
Yes.
or you might have an empathy buddy to whom you may even outpour your, so-called
The
jackal.
jackal, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't hear of any technique in Buddhism which is giving you that relational space for reappraisal. I wanted to hear from you about this. Thank you.
That's so interesting what you say, and it's true, because in modern psychology, a lot of the emphasis is on the therapeutic relationship because they don't have contemplative practices, right? So that's an alternative method, is the reappraisal, the rehearsal on the meditation cushion through these contemplative practices, which most modern psychology does not take into consideration as a technique. So the relational piece is kind of the only thing that's available, which is one of the reasons His Holiness the Dalai Lama really wanted the training of the cultivating emotional balance, because it brings the contemplative piece and those techniques to bear. One kind of reparative relationship that I can think of that's very, very emphasized in Buddhism, of course, is the relationship between the teacher and the student, and the point of it is not the same kind of therapeutic relationship, but we're meant to visualize our teacher, for example, in a lot of our practices in Tibetan Buddhism. Imagine they're so happy with us, they're smiling at us, they're supporting us. And then hopefully we also get that level of support and encouragement and care. And then the Sangha, we take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. I think sometimes we don't think about the Sangha refuge as much as we should. We think about the Buddha and the Dharma, and we're like, oh yeah, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, whatever, Sangha. But actually to have the supportive community. So I think it's built in to those pieces of Buddhism just naturally, not maybe explicitly in the same way it is with modern psychology, but kind of built in. And then on top of that, we have the contemplative methods, which are now being brought into modern psychology more. So that's, yeah, how does that land?
Thanks so much. Very
Yeah.
well. Thank you.
Great. Anjali.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted you to elaborate more on the disabling of the triggers.
Yeah. So when we recognize, for example, that a trigger is due to some sort of distorted perception. For example, the example I give, my story that I'll be let down by people, right, is no longer true. It's actually even an exaggeration I have of certain experiences that I had when I was young, because when you're 4 years old, everything gets exaggerated. So I carried that story along. And then in the present day, when somebody cancels on me when I've asked them to help me, I'm just kind of using that as an example, it triggers that old narrative, that old storyline for me. With awareness, I can recognize that. And when that story starts up, I can disable that trigger by going, no, that's not really true. It wasn't even true in the past, and it's definitely not true now. So many people I can count on, right? So in that way, I don't get triggered with the strong emotion of sadness and disappointment in that case. And so through awareness, through understanding, through seeing these patterns, and that's why it's good to track the emotional episodes over time, because you can see these recurring themes. Our emotional, especially our regrettable emotions, are usually not a bunch of whole unique things. We can see these patterns, and then you can work to disable the trigger. I have this ongoing kind of conversation with Dr. Paul Ekman, one of the founders of the Cultivating Emotional Balance. And I say, the trigger can completely be removed. And he says, no, it can't, but it can be really reduced so that it's kind of no longer functioning. So that's the disabling, through that kind of awareness and tracking and seeing what story is underlying it that might be a distorted perception. Does that help, Anjali?
I'll try it and probably get back to you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, Anita.
So my question was on the trigger as well. You said yesterday physiological, and that's really speaks to me, because, for example, now menopause, for example, you're going through something. So I find definitely that I've things that I wouldn't get irritated with before, or there's a much shorter fuse, and so you say, okay, so it's not really a trigger per se, a special trigger, but it's a hormonal trigger that accents. So that's the physiological trigger, which you don't really have that much control on. But what I noticed was food. I mean, if you when I realized this, I said, okay, perhaps I should change my diet a bit and increase more estrogen-rich foods. So minute I did that over 2 weeks, I could find that seemed to have reduced substantially, and then the other triggers were not triggering anymore. So that's the physiological. And then, so being a scientist. I said, I want to check to see if it's true. So I stopped doing it for a week. And
And
again, so I came again, and again, it came up again, you know, and so physiological. I mean, we don't pay enough attention sometimes to,
absolutely. Yeah.
you know, and so I just wanted to bring that up and ask if
You
that
know,
could be also a question.
and in the Cultivating Emotional Balance course, we talk about the precondition to an emotional episode. And in the precondition, we say exactly that. What's our state, both emotionally and physiologically, that we're coming into the situation with, which is part of the trigger, for sure. You're exactly right. And we say, like, I often think there's a thing in, I think it's Alcoholics Anonymous, and they say, HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Bad news, right? Like, we're much more likely to become emotional if we're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, or going through menopause. Halt them. Maybe we'll add the menopause, you know, because then we're going into the situation already vulnerable, right? Already feeling off balance in a way. And so that's one of the things to bring awareness to. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we say that's part of the trigger, the event that happens, our underlying psychology, the narratives, the story, the personal background, and the precondition being our physiological and emotional state. If we're already feeling sad, if we're already feeling angry, if we're already feeling some emotion, and then we go into a situation that wouldn't have been triggering otherwise, but we're already emotional, then the chances are, you know, much, much higher. But that physiology is really important. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, great. All right. So anger, our favorite emotion, so exciting. So when I started taking this training in cultivating emotional balance, you know, I had been a Buddhist practitioner for many decades. And in my Tibetan Buddhist training, there was the idea that anger is always a negative emotion, right? There is no such thing as constructive anger. So I had a lot of debates, maybe even arguments with my teachers about this idea of anger having a function and sometimes being constructive. So I want to share a little bit of what I've learned with all of you, because I think a lot of you do have a background in Buddhism and might have the same kind of ideas that I had about anger. And I found one explanation really, really especially helpful. Then we'll look at anger, which everyone agrees is often enacted in a very destructive way. But does it have a function? Can it be constructive? That's the question. But first, what I want to do is share my screen, and we'll look a little bit at the theme and the function of anger. So we say that for anger, the theme is being thwarted in pursuit of a goal that matters to you, right? So there's a goal that matters to you, and there's some obstacle to that goal. There's an experiment that was done long ago, before they had a bunch of ethical guidelines about psychological research. They said they took these babies that were like 6 or 8 months old and put in front of the babies this like fun, colorful toy. And then they held the baby's arms behind their backs somehow, these experimenters, which just seems completely cruel. And the babies immediately expressed anger with the face, with the voice, all of the classic expression of anger. So that's the theme of anger. You want something that you can't get, basically, thwarted in pursuit of a goal that matters to you. The effects of anger: anger controls, punishes, and retaliates. The dangerous effects: anger calls forth more anger. It's really hard not to respond to anger with anger, especially when it appears unjustified. Okay, anger is often the trigger for more anger. Someone else's anger towards us is often the trigger for our anger back. And in Buddhist ethics, we have so many vows about non-retaliation, mostly because it's so hard not to retaliate when you're attacked, when someone yells at you, when someone criticizes you. Really, really difficult. People want to change anger because it's often so destructive. We can hurt others psychologically, physically. Many people are taught not to express anger, so experiencing anger can often give rise to guilt and shame. So often guilt and shame, we can respond to guilt and shame with anger, but anger can also be the fundamental emotion that makes us feel guilt and shame. And sometimes this is cultural, sometimes this is gendered. I've noticed with a lot of women, anger makes them feel guilt and shame, right? Because in many cultures, women are allowed to experience things like fear and sadness and not anger. In a lot of cultures, men are allowed to feel anger and not things like fear and sadness. So the irony is a lot of times when men feel things like fear and sadness, they become angry as a way to avoid feeling the fear and sadness. Anger becomes a secondary emotion. For some, our own anger can get out of control. And so we feel a fear about our own anger. So these are some of the ways that anger can become problematic. Now, in terms of this question of, we say that all emotions have a function. Removing an obstacle when we're thwarted in pursuit of a goal that matters to us, that is evolutionarily functional. So how can anger be constructive? And I found something that really helped me, especially in terms of the Buddhist view. There's a psychologist called Harvey Aronson, and he wrote this book. It's quite old now. I think he wrote it in the 90s, called Buddhist Practice on Western Ground. And he kind of compares some of these psychological ideas with Buddhist ideas. And he said the problem with the word anger in English, he says it means 4 different distinct but interrelated meanings. So when we read something, those of you who may have studied Master Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, there's a famous stanza that says, even one moment of anger directed towards a bodhisattva destroys eons of virtue. And so we get annoyed when our roommate doesn't do the dishes in the sink. And then we think, oh no, I've just destroyed eons of virtue from my one moment of anger. And so Harvey Aronson in this book, he unpacks these 4 distinct things that we mean by the word anger, the English word anger. And he said, the only thing that's meant in the Buddhist text is the intent to harm, right? Anger being the intent to harm, which we might think of more as the English word hatred. And so I found this so helpful, and I want to share this with you, Harvey Aronson's work. What does the word anger mean? So Buddhist Practice on Western Ground is the name of the book. The outright intent to harm. So I'm so angry, I could punch somebody. So the kind of anger that's said as being so destructive in the Buddhist text is this one, the one that includes an intent to harm. And then he said there could also be strong reactive dislike. When my cousin's child broke my expensive vase, I was so angry I screamed at them. Okay, not terrific, but you're not going to hurt your cousin's child, right? It's just meaning you're really upset by what happened. Assertiveness, proclaiming difference, creating independence, and setting boundaries. When my roommate looked at my mail, I got angry and told her to mind her own business, right? So somebody invades your space, crosses a boundary, right? This can provoke this kind of response. And then protesting injustice. We were so angry at the unfair hiring practices at that company that we organized a protest. And a lot of people ask about this last one. right? When discussions of anger come up in the context of Buddhist teachings, a lot of people say, well, how can I protest injustice without feeling angry? When you think of anger as the wish to remove an obstacle, that's still there. But one of the big questions for me these days, and I really try and bring it into all my teachings and all my conversations, is how do we do, especially the last two, how do we set boundaries? How do we protest injustice still strongly, but with compassion, right? We're still clear. We've got the clarity. We've got the decisiveness. We've got the, this obstacle needs to be removed. We've got that energy, but we're enacting it compassionately and not through blaming, shaming, intent to harm, and so on, right? So that could be an example of constructive anger if we define anger as just that energy of wanting to remove an obstacle, right? So this is really important, I think, to be clear about the terminology. The outright intent to harm, yes, that is destructive. And it's interesting because Paul Ekman, one of the founders of the Cultivating Emotional Balance, he says, anger can be either constructive or destructive. Hatred is always destructive. And so that's a nice way of putting it, right? This one we could call hatred. We say, yes, that's always destructive. Harming others is never justified. However, the energy behind anger, being that wish to remove an obstacle, can be motivating if we can enact it in a way that doesn't harm others. So I want to stop sharing for a moment, because for me, that was a clarifying and really useful distinction between those four different meanings of the word. Because like I said, for many of us who've studied Buddhism, we freak out like when we get the slightest bit, or we don't know how to set a boundary, and there's this idea that Buddhists, you're kind of a doormat and you're compassionate and anybody can do anything and you just have to roll over, and it just creates a lot of confusion for us. So I think being clear, I actually teach a one-day workshop called Compassionate Boundaries with a friend of mine who's a nonviolent communication teacher. And so he and I co-teach, like, how do we do that? How do we set boundaries compassionately? Because I think for a lot of people interested in a spiritual path, whether it's Buddhism or something else, they go to the other extreme thinking, oh, I need to be so nice all the time, do whatever people want us to. That's what loving kindness and compassion means. And then we wonder why we're so exhausted and burned out and people are taking advantage of us. And we're like, okay, something's wrong here. Okay. So any questions about those definitions or that presentation by Harvey Aronson? And it's tricky. It's very tricky because so often anger can lead to destructive behaviors. So balancing, like I say, that energy of wanting to remove an obstacle, maybe set a boundary, protest injustice with compassion. To me, that's the big question in my life right now, is how to do that myself, how to teach that to others, how to hold the space for that discussion. Any questions? Yes.
I think it's also a cultural. In the Indian context, women are not allowed to be angry. They're supposed to be patient and nurturant, while men can show anger, and particularly men who are in positions of privilege and power.
Yeah, true in the US also, and true in many, many, many countries. I mean, that might be one of the very universal gendered expressions of emotion, is what you just said, that's very, very common, of what is allowed by your gender, what's allowed by your culture. And that's a common theme. I think, I think for older generations, maybe more. I've noticed for younger men, in many countries, the feeling and expression of things like sadness and fear is a little bit more allowed, but still, I think a long way to go. And I think still for women to express anger, I mean, all I have to do is look at the US election in 2016 and some of the things that were said about, Hillary Clinton. I mean, it was ridiculous. The way that she expressed just not even anger, but just strength and, setting boundaries and making these strong statements, and how, because of her gender, it was perceived completely differently. So yeah, that's a big conversation for sure. Yeah.
Another important thing is in India, as you grow older, you're supposed to be more patient and
Yeah.
you're not, when you're young, maybe they'll say, okay, she's young, she's a bit hot-headed. But as you grow older, you're supposed to be very mild and tolerant and
That's right. That's
and
right.
taking a lot of nonsense from everybody.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you're considered, either a little eccentric or,
That's right.
not following the normative pattern of being, docile and accepting.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting conversation, talking about the culture and gendered and even individual family kind of display rules is what we call them, the display rules. Who's allowed to display which emotions when and which context. That's an interesting conversation. Yeah, Vanashri, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Venerable.
Yeah.
I mean, this clarity that you brought in terms of intent to harm as a very clear idea of, a goal of, a motivation that you're coming from with anger, as compared to, all of these other things, was like just amazing. It was just a light that went on.
Thank you.
Yeah, truly thankful for that. So I just wanted to ask you, one of the aspects of Buddhist psychology is the physiological changes that negative emotions bring us. So for example, even if we have a positive motivation in terms of protesting injustice, it can actually trigger the same biochemical reactions in the body. So can you just guide a little bit on how to manage that aspect of it?
Yeah. And that's such an interesting question. And that's why, as I said, a lot of what I'm giving thought to is how to kind of transform, like using that energy of anger, transforming it with compassion, because compassion activates a completely different physiology. The soothing system, Paul Gilbert, this psychologist Paul Gilbert, talks about 3 emotional regulation systems. And he talks about the drive system, the soothe system, and the threat system. And so if we can, even when we feel that motivation of anger, as much as possible, immediately start to bring compassion to bear, then the physiology of the parasympathetic nervous system, the oxytocin comes online, different the vagus nerve is activated, and, different physiology is activated that I think can offset the sometimes harmful physiology that's activated by anger. So that's a big question. It would be interesting to see if some research is done on that. But if we bring that compassion in, it can be protective against some of the hard, the side effects of constantly having that anger triggered and the physiology that goes along with that, because it's sort of like the activation of anger, and then immediately the compassion really helps to balance that physiology. Yeah, and that's just my theory, and it would be interesting to see how that plays out experimentally, and hopefully some of those, there's a lot of experiments about the physiology of compassion meditation and the positive effects on health of compassion meditation, but the juxtaposition of the anger and then moving into compassionate activism, for example, when you feel you're protesting injustice from a compassionate stance instead of an angry, blaming stance. That would be a great, PhD dissertation for someone. Hopefully someone takes that on. Great. Okay, we're going to look quickly at common triggers of anger and then some of the antidotes to anger, to the harmful kind of anger. And then we'll do a meditation practice because, as usual, we're already running out of time. There's just so much cool stuff to talk about. I never have enough time. This is a common problem. So let's look at some common anger triggers, and you might be able to relate to these. Also, see if there's anything you feel is an anger trigger for you that's not on this list. Interference and lack of efficacy. Okay, and that kind of relates to that theme of anger, of trying to remove an obstacle. Any kind of interference. Yesterday I mentioned road rage, right? Even just physically somebody obstructing you, any kind of interference. Disrespect. Wow, that's a big anger trigger. Disrespect. Someone trying to hurt us, right? So we're retaliating against harm. Another person's anger. And as Paul Ekman says, really, really hard not to feel anger if somebody's angry at you. And that's where the contemplative practice and the training comes in. Injustice, both societal and personal, like the example of not being given credit for hard work that you've done. We might feel that's unjust. I think many of us have maybe experienced that in a workplace. Disappointment in how a person has acted. Betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. And this is so deep. You know, when I think of, I've heard several people talk about our basic needs, and, you know, there's lists in nonviolent communication. Some of you might be familiar with those. And I've heard several psychologists talk about our three most basic needs are safety, belonging, and dignity or respect, right? And so when one of those three basic needs is not being met, often that can be a trigger for anger. And you think about how hard it is to feel abandonment and rejection, because in our evolutionary past, it literally meant we were going to die. If you were rejected by your tribe, there you were wandering around the Kalahari Desert, you were going to die. So that's why it's such a strong trigger for us. Being falsely accused, big anger trigger. Breaking a cultural rule, right? And so this obviously depends culture to culture. I notice in a lot of cultures, somebody cutting in line, like there's a queue for, you know, something in the bank or the post office or the train station or whatever, somebody breaking in line can be an anger trigger. Very simple cultural rule. So these are some common anger triggers. And so let's look at some strategies for dealing with our anger, antidotes, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So trying to see things from the other person's perspective. And as Priya asked the question earlier, in the moment when you're in the midst of the emotion, this is really, really hard to do. But later on, when you've calmed down a little bit, trying to see what's motivating the other person's behavior, putting yourself in their shoes. Don't take it personally. And this kind of relates to putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Often we're triggered by something because we think the other person's behavior is intended for us. It may not have anything to do with us at all. I have an example. Years ago, this friend of mine was married to this man. She had 2 teenage children. She and her husband got a divorce. He remarried someone much younger. He and the new wife were having a baby. And this really upset her because she felt like he was going to spend all of this time and attention on the new baby and not on the 2 teenage children that he already had. And at a certain point, the way she was talking was as if they had planned to have this new baby just to hurt her feelings. And at a certain point, I had to say, hey, wait a minute. I'm sure their decision to have a baby, you were not even on the radar. Like you had nothing to do with it. They weren't, you know, they didn't stay up all night trying to strategize. How can we really get back at her? Right? So sometimes our perception is so distorted and we take things personally. Is the other person mirroring your own unwanted and rejected qualities? This to me has been a huge insight. often I'm triggered the most by somebody's qualities that they're expressing that are the most similar to a quality I'm rejecting in myself, right? Often this is the case, something that we're doing that we're angry at ourselves for doing, or we're rejecting somehow in ourselves. So what, I find it really useful if I'm especially triggered by someone's actions, especially if friends of mine aren't at all, and it seems like there's some distortion going on, how am I doing that same thing myself? Like, is there a way that I'm doing something similar? And maybe it's something I don't like about myself. So when I see it being expressed in the other person, it's very triggering for me. Do you have a need that's not being met in the situation? Is somebody not fulfilling a need? Is there a way you could get that need met in another way? And checking your expectation. Sometimes we act as if we have an unspoken contract with someone else. We've never discussed it. We've never signed the piece of paper that they're supposed to fulfill our expectation, and they let us down. But maybe it's an expectation that's unrealistic, that we've never discussed with them. So checking your expectation, how much, because disappointment in someone else's behavior is a common anger trigger. But how realistic was that expectation? And then checking for an underlying emotion. Often anger can be a secondary emotion protecting us from the feeling of fear, hurt, and vulnerability, right? I think this is often the case with men. Just to generalize, we were talking about gender differences before. I've worked with men experiencing incarceration in men's prisons in many countries for the last 15 years. And I've seen this a lot. A lot of expressions of anger come because people are trying to remove the obstacle of feeling vulnerable, of feeling hurt, of feeling fear and sadness. And sometimes the most effective practices are allowing people to feel the vulnerability. And then that really helps with the anger, because they don't need to remove the feeling of feeling vulnerable by immediately going to anger. Anger doesn't feel good to feel, but often it feels safer to feel angry than it does to feel hurt, fear, sadness, or vulnerability. So often there can be an underlying emotion. Is there an important message? Sometimes my anger manifests the most as sort of irritation and frustration, irritability. When I start to feel that a lot, I use that as a message to ask myself, okay, what about my life isn't working out for me right now? There's something out of balance. If I'm just feeling this low level kind of irritability all the time, what's going on? Right? Some need is not being met. Something's out of balance in my life. So using that emotion as a signal, as a message for me to do some investigation and maybe correct and rebalance my life. And then keeping a healthy distance from triggering objects. And we talked about that. That's not avoidance. That's not denial, but in the short term, until we've developed some more robust strategies for managing our emotions, if we know that a certain situation is always going to be triggering, especially if it's going to be triggering of unkind, harmful, destructive speech and actions, just stay away as much as possible from the triggering objects until you've built up more strategies. And then cultivating the antidotes, cultivate loving kindness and compassion. So we say that cruelty is the opposite of compassion. Hatred is the opposite of loving kindness. So if we cultivate these antidotes, it's impossible for them to coexist in the mind at the same time. So in the meantime, cultivating these qualities of loving kindness and compassion. So we're going to do a practice where we're going to recall from our memory a time when we felt anger, and then see if any of these strategies will be helpful. I'll guide you through a contemplative practice. Then we'll have some time for any kind of feedback or questions you have or reflections on some of these strategies for managing anger. Okay? So I'll guide you through. For this practice, it's going to be a conceptual practice. I'll prompt you with some things to think about. And so just really pick an experience from your own life, not just theoretical anger, but draw from memory. Or if there's a anger trigger that you experience a lot that you'd like to bring some awareness to, you can do that in this practice as well. So it can either be a single event, or it might be something that you experience quite often. And we'll try to see if any of these strategies I just mentioned are helpful for bringing some awareness and insight into that anger trigger. And then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. Okay, so go ahead and get in your meditation posture, whatever is a comfortable position for you. In front of the computer is often not where we'd love to be meditating, but we do our best on Zoom. So try to get comfortable with your back straight, your shoulders even. Your hands can be resting in your lap or on your knees. If you have your tongue on the roof of your mouth, right behind your front teeth, that keeps you from having to swallow constantly. And your eyes can either be closed or in a hooded gaze. And let's take a moment to just do a body scan to just make sure that we're completely relaxed. For all of you, I think it's the end of a long day. For me, it's still early in the morning. But if it's the end of a long day, you might have some tension or tightness in your body. So starting at the crown of the head and just moving your awareness through your body, relax your forehead, your eyes. Notice your jaw. As much as possible, we're breathing through our nose, not through our mouth. So keeping our mouth closed, but your jaw not clenched and tight, your jaw relaxed. And then your neck and shoulders. And this is a place that we often hold tightness or tension. And just trying to relax into your neck and shoulders. Lift your sternum, open up your chest, get that nice upright posture. And relaxing the belly. Relaxing the buttocks. Relaxing all the way down to the feet. And then we'll round off this initial settling of the body with 3 deep breaths. So deep diaphragmatic breath all the way down to the diaphragm. And this activates that soothing system that we were talking about before. It activates the vagus nerve. So all the way down to the diaphragm, all the way out, 3 times. And then after the 3 deep diaphragmatic breaths, just taking a moment to settle with the natural respiration, the natural sensations of the breath in the body. Just for a few moments to settle the mind. So keeping your attention on the bodily sensations wherever you can feel them, maybe the diaphragm, maybe the chest as the lungs expand and contract, maybe the nostrils. And when your attention wanders, just releasing any distraction and returning to the breath. And now take a moment to draw from memory, thinking of a time, maybe a time recently when you became angry. And anger is a whole family of emotions that can range anywhere from irritation and frustration all the way up to rage, belligerence. So it could be any level of anger, even just irritation, frustration. So draw from your memory. It can be helpful to think of something recent that's a little bit fresh, or maybe there's an example that is recurring in your life that you'd like to bring some attention to. And as that example comes to mind, just think of the details of the situation, the person, the situation, the incident, what happened, who said what, all of the details. And you might feel that you're slightly triggered for anger again. You might start to feel it in your body. Try not to be too flooded with emotion, but it's okay. You might feel a little bit triggered. Memory is one of the triggers of emotion. But if you feel that it's starting to feel overwhelming, just go back to the breath. But recalling as many details as you can. Bringing awareness to the trigger of that anger, what was happening, what was the incident, who was there, what was said. And as you bring this episode to mind, and maybe start to re-trigger the emotion of anger through your memory, notice how it feels in your body. Are there any physical sensations that accompany that experience? And then thinking again of that incident that you brought to mind, what did your experience of anger make you do? Did you respond in any way physically or verbally? What was your behavior when you became angry? There are different styles of anger, and sometimes those styles are learned. Sometimes with anger, we do react strongly, verbally or physically. Sometimes with anger, we withdraw completely. Stonewalling is a phrase for a behavior. Sometimes we enact when we're angry, which is just shutting down completely, not interacting. So what's your anger style? Maybe the way that you responded in the incident that you drew from memory is representative of a certain anger style. So do you have the typical anger style, and where did you learn this style? Are you reacting in a way that maybe one of your parents did? And then if you've recognized a certain anger style, a certain typical way that you respond, what are some of the payoffs of this style, some of the benefits of this style? And what are some of the drawbacks of this style? So are there any advantages to this anger style? And what are the drawbacks? Maybe in terms of how it makes you and other people feel. What's the impact on other people in your life? And now we're going to investigate if any of the antidotes that we talked about earlier might help you in this situation, might attenuate that trigger of anger. So first, can you imagine what was going on for the other person? Can you put yourself in the other person's shoes, try and see things from their perspective? Just take a moment and see. Often with things that are triggering of anger, our perspective narrows to just our own self-interest, but try and put yourself in the other person's shoes. Take their perspective. And from that insight, sometimes we notice that we're taking things really personally, as if it were intended to harm us. But when we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, we see that the other person's behavior really had nothing to do with us. So perhaps you get an insight that you don't need to take it so personally. Could it be that the other person is mirroring your own unwanted qualities? So is there something about their behavior that's triggering of your anger because they're mirroring an aspect of yourself that you're rejecting or that's unwanted? Maybe on some level, maybe it's not as extreme as their behavior, but maybe there's something there. Check. Are they mirroring some unwanted behavior in yourself? And then check, in that situation, did you become angry because you had a need that wasn't being met? And perhaps an expectation of the other person's behavior. So how much of that anger that you experienced was because you weren't getting your needs met, maybe expecting something from the other person? And then check for an underlying emotion. Often anger can be a secondary emotion, and what's more basic is a feeling like fear or hurt or sadness or some kind of vulnerability. So see if underlying the anger, was there some feeling of vulnerability or some underlying emotion that you were actually trying to protect yourself from feeling by getting angry? Can you hold the space and get an insight into that underlying emotion? And we say that all emotions have a function to give us information, important information. What was the message of that anger? Is that anger trying to tell you something? Maybe that there's changes you need to make in your life, maybe changes about the way you're relating to someone. Can you get the underlying message of that anger? And then perhaps that situation that you brought to mind is something that is a recurring trigger for you. Do you need to just keep a healthy distance from that triggering object, whether it's a certain situation, a certain kind of conversation, or a specific person, until you develop more strategies for your anger? Again, this isn't denial, it's just wisdom in the short term to just make the choice as much as possible to avoid something that's going to be overwhelming, especially if we feel our behavior can be destructive. So is there a choice you need to make in terms of avoiding this kind of situation? And then taking a moment to just think of these different strategies and which ones felt the most effective for your situation, the most important. Which ones would you like to remember and implement and bring more awareness to in your life with your own episodes of anger? And then just taking a moment to reflect on this work that you've done, focusing on anger like this, bringing these episodes to mind requires courage and bravery. So just giving yourself a moment of kindness and compassion for the work that you've done. You might like to bring your hands to your heart, one hand or both hands on your chest, just symbolizing this self-kindness and self-compassion, giving yourself a moment of soothing and affirmation and rejoicing for this courageous work that you've done to try and bring mindfulness to your episode of anger. And then just settling again with the breath for a few moments. Okay. So we've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to see if we could stop recording for the last 10 minutes so that people can share more. So for me, about setting boundaries, yes, this is difficult, especially I think for many of us. For maybe decades, we had this idea that if you're a compassionate person, you do what everybody wants. And then all of the things that are extra about, I want everybody to like me. This is my cultural expectation. This is my gendered expectation, the whole thing, So how do we set boundaries? In the beginning, I find when we start, we almost always are coming from this defensive, strident place because we just have no practice at all. And we almost need to push too hard in this way just because we're so out of practice. There's two things I'd like to suggest that might be helpful. One is remembering that it doesn't do any good at all if we're burned out, if we're depleted. Like I think in Buddhism, we talk about equalizing and exchanging self and others. And in the same way that means we're not arrogant and self-absorbed and everybody else doesn't matter at all. It also doesn't mean that things get out of balance in the other way, that we're not taking care of our own needs at all. We're getting depleted. We're just serving others, because that often, especially when we're depleted, can turn into doing it resentfully, not doing it with a compassionate, altruistic motivation at all. There's so much research. I mean, that's one thing. There's a lot of research about burnout, especially for people in healthcare professions, because it's such a common experience. So reminding ourselves, we need to keep resourced, we need to keep balance. And sometimes a way of resourcing ourselves is saying no, even if someone has an expectation, but just with clarity. We don't have to do it really pushing back stridently with defensiveness and aversion. We just are like, I've considered that request, and for now, I really need to not do that. Can we do that? And it's hard in the beginning. What I recommend to people, because often the people that they need to do that with are their family or their intimate relationships or the people really close to them. So I always advise people, practice setting boundaries in very low stakes relationships until you get used to it. I'll give you an example. I had a student who actually came to me because she was in a workplace and she was being sexually harassed by her boss. And she came to me for advice about how to be compassionate. And what I said to her was, you need to go to human resources and file a complaint. What he's doing is absolutely, totally beyond the bounds. And she wasn't expecting me to say that. And I was like, oh, absolutely not. And then we started this whole process of working on her practicing setting boundaries. And I said, you can't do it with him right away. He's your boss, but start with a low stakes relationship. And she goes, oh, the accountant she worked for a law firm. She goes, the accountant in the law firm hasn't reimbursed me for some receipts that I turned in. And I said, perfect. You don't care about her. She's just in some office down the hall. Go in and say, look, I need my reimbursement by Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And she did. And it worked out fine. The other person didn't get angry. She didn't hate her. You know, we have too much of a story about the reaction of the other people when we set boundaries. And I find when we start doing it and we realize sometimes people in our lives even appreciate it. I had someone tell me once, thank goodness you finally expressed what you need. I'm so tired of guessing. You never express what you want and what you need. What a relief. You finally told me. So sometimes people in our life appreciate it. So we get a little bit of practice like that. And then in the high stakes relationships with our loved ones, then when we've practiced a little bit and we can do it without so much of a charge because we're feeling defensive about it, then we can do it. That's what I found to be helpful. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot to the boundary setting. Like I said, we have a whole day-long workshop about that. Does that help, Anita?
Thank you very much. Very much.
Good. For sure. All of that, you know, because I mean, I think what you've said brings up so many points, and this is a process, and it may be at the beginning, we look at a strategy and we're like, okay, I'm not ready yet for that. Like that's going a little far. Putting myself in the other person's shoes, why should I do that? I'm not really ready for that. And that's fine. And then the self-compassion that we were talking about before, just taking it step by step. I mean, sometimes for me, with my compassion practice, I will try to have compassion for someone maybe that's hurt me, and it feels like I'm just hitting a brick wall. And I go, okay, doesn't feel like anything's moving at all. It's just I'm slamming against a brick wall, but I just trust the practice and I keep trying, you know, over and over without pushing myself, without making myself wrong, that it's not working. So really seeing these strategies as long-term projects and long-term processes and not pushing. And then sometimes you'll find you'll have a breakthrough. You'll just keep doing it. You keep kind of slamming against the brick wall. And then there will be an insight or there will be a breakthrough. There was this one Tibetan Buddhist Lama called Shaktu Rinpoche, and he explained meditation once as like pouring, you know, dirty water through a filter over and over and over again. And every time you do it, it filters out a little bit more. And I love that sort of metaphor for meditation. You can't expect everything to be cleansed the first time. We just keep trying and keep really trusting the practice. So that process, you know, and being patient and really at the root of all of it, the self-compassion, we just did our best. And even the things that we think of as maybe dysfunctional now function to protect us maybe when we were a small child and not getting that care that we deserved and expected and wanted so much. And so we developed some strategy of maybe armoring or maybe keeping people away or something that kept us safe. But now we can re-examine, is it still something that's going to keep me safe, or is it something that actually is going to impede my well-being? But always with that self-kindness and self-compassion and not pushing and striving. You know, thank you so much. That was a beautiful reflection on the practice. Thank you. Are helpful when we're starting with these practices is kind of like picking the low stakes relationships. When we start to apply these antidotes, maybe picking something that's not so triggering, like maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, picking an anger episode that's maybe a 4 or 5, or maybe even a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. Because if we pick something that's got too much of a charge to it, then when we bring it to mind and recall it, then yeah, we're going to get really activated. And then we might put ourselves into that refractory period where our cognitive ability to actually even do the practice and apply the antidotes is a little bit offline. So, I should have mentioned that too. If we're picking something that's recent that has a very, very high charge, we might want to try practicing with the antidotes and becoming familiar with the antidotes to maybe something that doesn't have that much of a charge, maybe something that it's a level of annoyance or irritation, not like being really let down by someone or really being triggered, because then we're just going to be triggered to too strong of an emotion and we won't be able to even have the cognitive piece functioning. So that's one suggestion. And then one of the reasons that we ended with the self-compassion practice, just a moment of kindness and compassion, always bringing that in, because doing this work is hard work, even when it's a 3 or 4 on a scale of 1 to 10, going back to that place of bringing to mind any kind of anger episode or time that we felt triggered or even irritated or frustrated. Oh, we don't want to do that. We just want to be happy. So it's sort of that brave practice and always grounding it in that self-compassion. So it may be that as we're practicing, always adding maybe a 10 minutes of a self-compassion practice onto the end to then regulate your nervous system after the activation, but especially not picking something that's so difficult when we're just training in the techniques and maybe waiting until we have more, either waiting until we're, a little bit more familiar with the antidotes and the practices, or maybe until the charge is a little bit reduced because maybe some more time has passed since that episode has happened. So that's a suggestion about how to manage that.
Okay, I have another question, and that's
it almost feels like to set a boundary, we have to push so far, even to express where like there's so much of a charge to it. I'm a really visual person. I always think of these visual kind of metaphors, and I think, okay, my boundary is right here between me and the other person. Like I think of almost like a plexiglass shield. I just need to establish my no or my boundary or what I need. I don't have to push all the way into their space. I can just very calmly come up to that space in the middle between me and them and make a calm statement of what I can do and what my needs are. In the beginning, it almost feels like you have to completely go into their space and push them back. But I think there's always that space in the middle. If I can just meet it, then I can do it with calm and with clarity and in a way that's effective, because they don't feel that they're being attacked or somehow pushed back. It's almost like a spatial thing in my mind. I mean, even though it's an emotional thing and something that we're expressing in language, when I think of it as just I'm meeting the space in between me and that other person and saying, okay, this is my boundary, this is my limit, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. And it feels to me, and it's taken practice to get to that point, and I'm still not perfect at it. And I tried practicing with the low stakes relationships, and then I think, oh, that went really well. The person doesn't hate me. They haven't kicked me out of their life. They actually kind of appreciated my clarity. And then we get the confidence, but it does take time. But I think, for me, thinking spatially almost was really helpful in terms of, no, I just need to come up to my boundary. I don't need to push them back, in some way. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me, that's kind of what worked in my mind as a way to have the confidence and the clarity, which is usually met with a lot of understanding. I mean, I've never really had somebody go, oh, we can't be friends anymore because you said what you needed. That's never happened, even in my close relationships. So we just keep doing it until we have the confidence. Yeah.
Yeah, but I was thinking,
Master Shantideva in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, he keeps saying, just be like a piece of wood. We don't have to be reactive. If people come at us with that energy, we can, if we're grounded in our own truth, if we're grounded confidently, then we don't have to be reactive towards them. I mean, I think sometimes we feel threatened by that. I think sometimes we need to feel defensive and like we need to push back. But if we're just steady and grounded in our own truth and our own experience, we don't really need to let them just discharge. That's just a style that they have, that we don't need to meet that. We don't need to kind of retaliate by rising our energy to that same level of energy. But it's not easy. It takes a lot of practice.
Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you. And then let's see, I think we had Kshama, you had your hand up before. Do you still have a question? Okay. Oh, she dropped off. Okay. Kshama, did you have a question? You had your hand up before. Okay. Maybe not. So thank you all for your patience going half an hour over, but it was great to really hear what's coming up for people. I think with those kind of meditations that we do where we're really looking at people's experience can be the, the real testing ground for these antidotes, and are they really going to be effective? So thank you all for your time and your patience and your attention these last 2 mornings. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all. So thank you.
Venerable, before you go, I really want to thank you. I see Tess has their hand up, so would you be willing to take one more question or comment?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Emotional balance training, we just say it's about choice. It's just about, exercising our choice about our emotional life. So it sounds like you made one choice and then you made a different choice yesterday that gave you a lot of peace of mind. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Oh, Kshama, you've got your hand up. Yes, please.
Shamaji, can you unmute yourself? Sorry, can you unmute yourself?
I did unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
It's a little distorted, but yeah, let's try.
Can you hear me? I think my connection hasn't been very good. I think
okay.
my bandwidth has been shared by other Zoom calls.
Okay, now you're clear. Now you're clear, Kshama.
Okay, yeah. So I was saying that my difficulty in the family situation is exactly reversed. Like I like to have my boundaries, but I just cannot get that feedback so clearly for various reasons. I have twins who are just 18 years old, so they just unable to. I don't know what to say. That it's lack of discipline, and I just get very irritated, and that makes me shout. And I don't lose compassion for myself, and that's because of I have been practicing. I haven't been practicing regularly, but 25 years ago, when I practiced very rigorously mindfulness as well as the bhavana, and really helped me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I only caught part of that because your sound was quite distorted, but it sounded like you were saying that the practices helped in the end, but it is a process. And I'm sorry I didn't hear all of what you said because there was a lot of distortion in the audio.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can hear me now properly or no.
It kind of keeps going in and out, Kshama. It's quite distorted.
I don't.
Yeah, it's hard to
Okay,
get.
anyway, it was like lovely to be part of it. I will catch up with you sometime on the email or something. Because my good man, it's good. But I've been very grateful to be part of this whole thing and for things. We're very happy for that.
Great. Thank you so much for that feedback. Yeah, it's been lovely to be with all of you.
So really, I want to thank all the participants for also staying for another 30 minutes, and mostly my deep gratitude to Venerable Tenzin Chogkyi for giving us these very precious teachings and time. We obviously didn't have the karma to have you in India over the last few years, but thanks to Zoom and the pandemic, maybe we are reviving our karma and we can have more teachings from you. And of course, from our side, really positive wishes for your good health and for, all your wishes to be accomplished spontaneously. And we're really grateful. I think these are topics which are very close to our heart, and the intersectional perspective that you bring is so precious. So thank you so much, Venerable.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been lovely to be with all of you, some old friends and lots of new friends. And I've really enjoyed these last 2 days with all of you, and all the best. Please stay safe out there with the ongoing pandemic and all of what's going on in the world. And yeah, all the best to everybody. And thank you so much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Hopefully see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, Venerable, thank you. And thank you so much for, let me just pause the recording.